I was standing in the driveway with 2 suitcases and a garbage bag. My mother was inside the house pretending she couldn't hear me knock. My brother's car was parked where mine used to be. The locks had been changed that morning while I was at work. I didn't cry. I didn't yell. I just stood there feeling something inside me go completely silent. She opened the door once. Just once. She said, "You're not important right now. Your brother needs the space more than you do. He's going through something." Then she closed it again. I could see her shadow through the frosted glass. She was waiting for me to leave. So I did. I loaded everything into my car. The garbage bag ripped halfway and some of my clothes fell onto the driveway. I picked them up slowly. I wanted her to see me through the window. I wanted her to watch what she was doing. But she never came back to look. The curtains stayed closed. The house stayed silent. I sat in my car for almost 20 minutes. I kept thinking she would come out. That she would say it was a misunderstanding. That she would tell me to come back inside. But nothing happened. A neighbor walked by with their dog and stared at me. I started the engine and left. I called my best friend Emma. She answered on the second ring. I said I need a place to stay. She didn't ask questions. She just said, "Come over." When I got there, she had already cleared space in her living room. She made tea. She sat with me. She didn't say anything, and I was grateful for that. That first night I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying the conversation from 3 days earlier. My mother had called me into the kitchen. She said, "Your brother is moving back home." I said okay. She said he needs his own space. I said the house is big enough. She said not for both of you. I laughed because I thought she was joking. She wasn't. She said he's going through a hard time right now and he needs support. I said I live here too. She said, "You have a job. You're stable. He needs me more." I asked for how long. She said, "I don't know. Maybe a few months." I said fine, I'll stay in my room and stay out of his way. She said that's not going to work. I said why not? She said because he asked for you to leave. I stared at her. I said he asked for me to leave. She nodded. I said and you agreed. She said he's struggling. I said so that means I get kicked out. She said don't be dramatic. You can find somewhere else to stay. It's temporary. I said how temporary? She said until he gets back on his feet. I asked what was wrong with his feet. She got annoyed. She said you know what I mean. I asked if she was serious. She said yes. I asked when. She said this weekend. I said that's 2 days. She said I know. I said where am I supposed to go? She said you'll figure it out. You always do. Then she walked out of the kitchen like we had just talked about the weather. I spent those 2 days looking at her differently. I watched the way she made my brother's favorite meals. I watched the way she laughed at his jokes. I watched the way she asked him about his day and nodded like everything he said mattered. She barely looked at me. When I asked her a question, she gave one-word answers. When I walked into a room, she walked out. On the second day, I asked my brother why he wanted me gone. He was sitting on the couch playing video games. He didn't look at me. He said, "I just need some space." I said, "From me?" He said, "From everything." I said, "That doesn't make sense." He said, "You wouldn't understand." I said, "Try me." He paused his game. He looked at me. He said, "Mom and I already talked about this. Just respect the decision." I said, "This is my home too." He said, "And now it's mine." I said, "For how long?" He shrugged. He said, "As long as I need it." I said, "That's not fair." He said, "Life's not fair." Then he unpaused his game. I stood there for a minute waiting for him to say something else. He didn't, so I walked away. The morning I got kicked out, I woke up early. I packed my things quietly. I didn't want to give anyone the satisfaction of seeing me upset. I took my clothes, my laptop, my books, anything that mattered. I left behind furniture because I had nowhere to put it. I left behind photos because I didn't want to remember. I thought my mother would at least say goodbye. I thought she would feel something. But when I brought my bags downstairs, she was in the kitchen drinking coffee. She glanced at me. She said, "You have everything." I said, "Yes." She said, "Good." Then she went back to her phone. My brother wasn't even awake yet. I put my bags by the door. I stood there holding my keys. I said, "Are you sure about this?" She said, "We already discussed it." I said, "I know, but I'm asking again." She sighed. She said, "Your brother needs this house right now. You're young. You'll be fine." I said, "That's not the point." She said, "Then what is the point?" I didn't answer. I just left. When I tried to come back that evening to get one more box, I realized the locks were changed. I knocked. My mother came to the door but didn't open it. She talked through the glass. She said, "What do you need?" I said I left a box in my closet. She said, "I'll mail it to you." I said, "I'm standing right here, just let me in." She said, "No." I said, "Why?" She said, "Because your brother doesn't want any disruptions right now." I felt something snap inside me. I said, "You changed the locks?" She said, "Yes." I said, "You didn't tell me." She said, "I didn't think I had to." I said, "This is insane." She said, "You're being dramatic again." I said, "I lived here my whole life." She said, "And now you don't." I asked where my house key was. She said I threw it away. Then she walked away from the door. That's when I stopped trying. I didn't text. I didn't call. I didn't ask Emma to reach out on my behalf. I just went completely quiet. Emma asked if I was okay. I said yes. She said, "You don't seem okay." I said, "I'm fine, I just need to think." She said, "About what?" I said, "Everything." I kept working. I kept smiling at customers. I kept pretending my life wasn't falling apart. But at night I would lie on Emma's couch and stare at the ceiling and wonder what I did wrong. I ran through every conversation, every argument, every moment where maybe I said the wrong thing. And I couldn't find it. I couldn't find the reason why I deserved this. Emma said, "You didn't do anything wrong." I said, "Then why does it feel like I did?" She said, "Because the people who hurt us always make us think it's our fault." I said, "Maybe I wasn't a good enough daughter." She said, "Stop." I said, "Maybe I should have been more supportive." She said, "Stop it." I said, "Maybe if I had just been better." She grabbed my shoulders. She said, "Listen to me. You're not the problem. They are." But I didn't believe her. Not yet. A week went by. Then too, I heard nothing. My mother didn't check in. My brother didn't send a single message. It was like I never existed. I checked the family group chat. They were still posting in it. My mother shared a recipe. My brother shared a meme. I was still in the chat. They just weren't talking to me. I thought about leaving the group, but I didn't. I wanted to see if anyone would notice. No one did. Emma's boyfriend came over one night. He didn't know the whole story. He asked where I was living permanently. Emma said she's figuring it out. He said, "How long has it been?" Emma said, 2 weeks. He looked at me. He said, "Your family hasn't called." I said, "No." He said, "That's messed up." I said, "Yeah." He said, "Are you going to do anything about it?" I said, "Like what?" He said, "I don't know. Something." That's when the idea started forming. I didn't know what it was yet. I just knew I wasn't going to sit around waiting for an apology that would never come. I started going through my old messages. I wanted to understand my brother better. I wanted to see if there were signs I missed. And there were. So many signs. 6 months earlier, he had posted in the family chat about a new business venture. He said he was flipping products, buying them cheap and selling them high. My mother said, "That's amazing." I said, "What kind of products?" He said, "Electronics mostly." I said, "Where are you getting them?" He said, "Online." I said, "From where?" He didn't answer. A month after that, he posted a photo of a designer watch. He said, "Look what I just flipped." My aunt commented asking how much he made. He said, "Enough." My mother said, "I'm so proud of you." I didn't comment. Something felt off. Then 2 months before I got kicked out, he asked me for a favor. He said he needed to use my name for a business account. I said, "Why?" He said because his credit wasn't good enough. I said, "That's a red flag." He said, "It's not a big deal." I said, "If it's not a big deal, use your own name." He got mad. He said, "Forget it." My mother texted me privately after. She said, "Why can't you just help your brother?" I said, "Because it doesn't make sense." She said, "You're always so difficult." I screenshotted all of it. I didn't know why yet. I just did. Then one morning, Emma shook me awake. She said, "You need to see this." She handed me her phone. It was a post in the neighborhood Facebook group. Someone had shared a photo of my mother's house. There were 3 police cars outside, an ambulance, people standing on the lawn. The caption said, "Major police activity on Maple Street. Does anyone know what happened?" I sat up. My heart was racing. Emma said, "I think something happened to your brother." I checked my phone. 7 missed calls. 4 from my mother. 3 from a number I didn't recognize. No voicemails. I didn't call back. I just sat there staring at my phone. Emma said, "Are you going to see what happened?" I said, "No." She said, "What if it's serious?" I said, "Then they'll tell me eventually." She said, "You're really not going to call?" I said, "No." She looked at me like she didn't recognize me. Maybe she didn't. Maybe I didn't recognize myself anymore either. Part 029. Oh, characters confirmed. An hour later, someone knocked on Emma's door. She looked through the peephole and then looked at me. She said, "It's your mom." I didn't move. Emma said, "Do you want me to tell her to leave?" I said, "No, let her in." I wanted to see what excuse she had this time. Emma opened the door. My mother rushed in. Her eyes were red. Her hair was messy. She looked like she hadn't slept. She saw me on the couch and walked straight toward me. She said, "Why didn't you answer your phone?" I said I was sleeping. She said, "Your brother got arrested." I just stared at her. She said, "Did you hear me?" I said, "Yes." She said, "Is that all you're going to say?" I said, "What do you want me to say?" She looked at Emma like she expected her to leave. Emma didn't move. My mother turned back to me. She said, "I need you to come home." I said, "Why?" She said, "Because I need help." I said, "With what?" She said, "Everything. The police came this morning. They took your brother. They took his computers, his phone, everything." I said, "Okay." She said, "Okay. That's it." I said, "What else is there?" She started crying. She said, "How can you be so cold?" I said, "I learned from the best." She stopped crying for a second. She looked hurt. I didn't care. She said, "This is serious." I said, "I'm sure it is." She said, "He made a mistake." I said, "What kind of mistake?" She didn't answer right away. I said, "Mom, what did he do?" She said, "He was running a business." I said, "I know." She said, "It wasn't exactly legal." I felt my stomach drop. I said, "What does that mean?" She said, "He was buying and selling things." I said, "You already told me that." She said the things he was buying were purchased with stolen credit card information. The room went quiet. Emma looked at me. I looked at my mother. I said, "He was committing fraud." She said, "It's not that simple." I said, "Yes, it is." My mother sat down. She put her face in her hands. She said, "The police said he's been doing this for over a year. They said they've been investigating him for months." I said, "And you had no idea?" She said, "No." I said, "Where did you think he was getting all that money?" She said, "He told me he was flipping products." I said, "With what starting capital?" She didn't answer. She looked up at me. She said, "I need you to help me pay for a lawyer." I laughed. I actually laughed. She said, "This isn't funny." I said, "You're right, it's not." She said, "Then why are you laughing?" I said, "Because 2 weeks ago you told me I wasn't important. You kicked me out of my own home. You changed the locks. And now you want my help." She said, "You're my daughter." I said, "And I was your daughter 2 weeks ago too." She stood up. She said, "I didn't raise you to be this selfish." I said, "You didn't raise me at all. You raised him. And look how that turned out." She slapped me. Not hard, but hard enough. Emma stepped forward. She said, "You need to leave." My mother looked at her. She said, "This is between me and my daughter." Emma said, "I don't care. You need to leave now." My mother looked back at me. She said, "When you're ready to act like family, you know where to find me." Then she left. I touched my face. It didn't hurt, but something inside me felt different. Emma sat next to me. She said, "Are you okay?" I said, "Yeah." She said, "What are you going to do?" I said, "I don't know yet." But I knew. I just wasn't ready to say it out loud. That night I couldn't stop thinking. I kept going through everything my brother had said, everything he had posted, every time he bragged about a deal, every time my mother praised him. And I realized something. He didn't just get caught. He got sloppy. And sloppy people leave trails. I opened my laptop. I went through every screenshot I had saved. I made a folder. I organized everything by date. Then I started looking for patterns. In March, he posted about buying 12 laptops. In April, he posted about selling them for triple the price. In May, he asked me to co-sign a loan. I said no. He called me useless. In June, he posted a photo of a luxury bag. He said he flipped it for $2,000 profit. In July, he posted about a new car. My mother commented saying she was so proud. I commented asking how he afforded it. He never replied. I kept digging. Then I found something. A message from August. He had sent it in a smaller family group chat. He said, "If anyone needs help opening a credit account, let me know. I have connections." My cousin replied asking what kind of connections. He said, "Just trust me." Nobody questioned it. I sat back. I thought about what the police said. Over a year of fraud. Months of investigation. I searched for my cousin's name in my contacts. I called her. She answered. I said, "Hey, it's me." She said, "Oh, hey." I said, "Did you ever take my brother up on that credit account offer?" She paused. She said, "What offer?" I said, "The one from August." She said, "Oh, that." Yeah, I did. Why? I asked what happened. She said he helped me open a store card. I said, did you fill out the application? She said no, he said he'd handle it. I said, and you got approved? She said yeah. I said, have you checked the statements? She said no, why would I? I said, because I think you should. She said, you're scaring me. I said, just check and call me back. She called back 20 minutes later. She was crying. She said, there are charges on here I didn't make. Thousands of dollars. I said, when? She said, over the last 4 months. I said, do you have the card? She said no. She said, my brother said he'd hold on to it until I needed it. I closed my eyes. I said, he used your identity. She said, what? I said, he opened that account in your name and he's been using it. She said, oh my God. I said, you need to report this. She said, to who? I said, the police. She said, but he's family. I said, he's also a criminal. She went quiet. Then she said, let me think about it. I said, don't think too long. Then I hung up. I called 2 more cousins. Same story. Both of them had let my brother help with credit applications. Both of them had charges they didn't recognize. One of them said, I'm calling the police. I said, good. The next morning I called the number that had tried to reach me. A man answered. He said, this is Detective Ramirez. I said, you called me yesterday. He said, yes. Are you the sister of the suspect? I said, yes. He said, we'd like to ask you some questions. I said, I have some information you might want. He said, what kind of information? I said, the kind that shows this wasn't just credit card fraud. I said, my brother used family members to open fraudulent accounts. He said, how do you know? I said, because I talked to them. He said, how many? I said, at least 3. Maybe more. He was quiet for a second. Then he said, can you come to the station? I said, when? He said, today if possible. I said, I'll be there in an hour. Emma drove me. She said, are you sure about this? I said, yes. She said, this is going to destroy your family. I said, my family destroyed itself. When we got to the station, Detective Ramirez met me in the lobby. He shook my hand. He said, thank you for coming. He took me to a small room. He sat down across from me. He said, so tell me what you know. I opened my phone. I showed him the screenshots. I showed him the messages. I showed him the dates and the names. He wrote everything down. He asked if I had more. I said yes. I sent him the folder. He opened it on his computer. He scrolled through it. He looked up at me. He said, this is very thorough. He asked why I was doing this. I said, because he's a thief. He said, he's also your brother. I said, that doesn't make him less of a thief. He asked if my mother knew I was here. I said, no. He said, is she going to be upset? I said, yes. He said, and you're okay with that? I said, I'm okay with the truth coming out. As I stood up, he said, one more thing. I turned around. He said, we found attempts to open accounts in your name too. I felt my chest tighten. I said, attempts? He said, yes. They were all declined. I said, why? He said, you have fraud alerts on your credit file. I said, I set those up for work. He said, well, they saved you. Your brother tried 4 times. I sat back down. I said, 4 times? He said, yes. Over 6 months. He said most of his other victims weren't protected. I said, who else? He said, at least 8 people. I said, 8. He nodded. I said, all family. He said, mostly. I put my head in my hands. When I left the station, Emma was waiting. She said, how did it go? I said, he tried to steal my identity. She said, what? I said, 4 times. She said, oh my God. 2 days later, my phone started ringing. My aunt, my uncle, cousins I hadn't talked to in years. They all got calls from the police. They all had to file reports. They all asked the same question. Did you know? I said no. They said the police said you gave them evidence. I said yes. They said why? I said because it was the right thing to do. Some of them agreed. Some called me a traitor. My mother showed up again. This time she didn't cry. She just looked angry. She said, you talked to the police. I said yes. She said, you gave them evidence against your own brother. I said yes. She said, do you know what you've done? I said, I helped them do their job. She said, you ruined his life. I said, he ruined his own life. She said, the family is furious. I said, I know. She said, they're blaming me. I said, maybe they should. She said, you did this on purpose. I said, yes. She said, to hurt me. I said, no. I said, I did this because you told me I wasn't important and I wanted to show you what important looks like. She stared at me. She said, you're not my daughter anymore. I said, I stopped being your daughter the day you changed the locks. I didn't hear from her for 3 weeks. My brother took a plea deal. 3 years in prison. Restitution to all his victims. My mother tried to visit him. He refused. He blamed her for not protecting him. I heard this from my cousin. She said your mom is a mess. I said okay. She said, do you feel bad? I said no. Emma helped me find an apartment. It was small. 1 bedroom. But it was mine. I signed the lease on a Saturday. I moved in on a Sunday. Emma brought pizza. Her boyfriend brought beer. We sat on the floor because I didn't have furniture yet. Emma said you did it. I said did what? She said you got out. I said yeah. I didn't go to any family events. I didn't respond to group messages. I just disappeared. Some people noticed. Most didn't. My mother sent one text. It said I hope you're happy. I didn't respond. 6 months later I ran into my aunt at the grocery store. She saw me and looked away. I said hi. She stopped. She said your mother's not doing well. I said okay. She said you should call her. I said no. She said why not? I said because I don't want to. She said that's cold. I said maybe. Then I walked away. I still think about that day. Standing in the driveway. Hearing those words. You're not important. Watching the door close. Feeling everything go silent inside me. I think about how one sentence changed everything. People ask if I regret it. I don't. People ask if I miss my family. Sometimes, but not enough to go back. I made one call. That's all it took. One call to make sure the truth didn't stay hidden. One call to prove that the person they threw away was the only one paying attention. If you were in my place, would you have done the same?